Welcome all. My name is Dr. Jim Tallmon. I teach for Wittenberg Academy. I have taught for Wittenberg Academy for a number of years. Rhetoric 1, 2, and 3. I recently, in my ongoing effort to retire, have passed off my duties at Wittenberg Academy to Reverend Paul Kane. But one of the hallmarks of my experience at Wittenberg Academy has been teaching Rhetoric 2, which is an argumentation and debate class. And I took the approach in the argumentation and debate class where we had a boot camp of the mind that was designed to lay down some of the basics of logic that were learned in earlier classes, and then provide a foil between argumentation in a mathematical and abstracted fashion and case-based argumentation about actual dilemmas. Not hypothetical dilemmas, mind you, but actual dilemmas. And then taking an Aristotelian tack, I had the remainder of the course broken down into 3 units. One was forensic argumentation, court of law. 2 was moral argumentation, medical ethics. 3 was deliberative rhetoric or policy argument, policy debate. So we concluded the year by learning how to write an affirmative case that would be used in a policy debate. But it's that middle unit on moral argumentation that is the focus of this presentation. And frankly, I was desirous of showcasing the work of one of my students, Miss, drum roll please, Sarah. The program just has her listed as Miss, Dr. Jim Tallmon and Miss Sarah Bjornstad. Sorry, I'd never say that right. Sarah Bjornstad wrote a paper for me on the Casuistry assignment on moral argumentation that was just first rate. It was as good as any college paper I had had, and believe me, I've had some good papers submitted through Wittenberg Academy by high schoolers. I have other students here today as well, and they've all done really good work, but Sarah's was stellar, and so I wanted to showcase it. And so rather than simply have her get up and read a paper, I thought, let's make a program out of this and invite Pastor Kane to share some of his insights and Mrs. Benson to share some of her insights. So I'm doing a little introductory unit, and then Sarah will read her paper for your listening pleasure and for your intellectual stimulation. And then that's this first session. And then in the afternoon, is it? I think it's the afternoon today. Or maybe it's tomorrow. When is your session, Pastor Kane?
Very end, right before itinerarium on Thursday.
Is it on Thursday?
It is.
Oh, okay. Are you separated from Mrs.?
Yes, they blessed us with our own sessions, so I'll supplement my 15 minutes of pastoral casuistry with an actual study. We're going to...
All right, great. Way to slip in a plug for your session right before we leave. Those are always difficult to draw people to. So that should be a really good session. It was intended that they would split a session like we did, and Mrs. Benson is going to talk about how casuistry augments the education for students at Wittenberg Academy and the value of it. And then Reverend Kane is going to talk about casuistry in the classroom, which he is now becoming very familiar, and casuistry in the Winkle, because pastors still practice casuistry. So it's going to be a kind of a thorough examination of it, and I think it's worth that kind of examination, but of course I'm biased. But I think you'll agree with me when you hear Sarah's paper. So let me just give you a 5-minute synopsis of how that assignment works. We'll hear from her, and then we should have plenty of time for discussion. How's that sound? All right. So it's an argumentation and debate class. I already told you that first we have an exposure to some of the principles, kind of a review actually, of some of the principles of argumentation from an elevated kind of status where the reasoning processes are mathematical and positivistic in the sense of the positive realm, and they're a bit abstracted. And then I show them how when you are concerned with rendering sound judgment in actual cases where, say, for example, you're sitting on a medical ethics committee and you want to do the right thing on behalf of a patient, your neighbor, and you are gathered together with a board of people that would consist most likely of an ethicist, chief medical director, the head of nursing maybe, and several other people, maybe an academic, and you're trying to determine, okay, here are the circumstances of the case, here's what the precedents are, here's what I think we ought to do, and honest people disagree about what the right thing to do would be. Okay? So you hash it out amongst yourselves, and if you're in a situation where time is of the essence, it's not really prudent to start philosophizing too much about the situation. That's why we have brown bags in the medical arena. People get together and contemplate principles upon which medical ethics are based and so forth. But where action is the aim, rhetoric is indispensable. Rhetorical reasoning would probably be more accurate. Rhetorical reasoning is case-based argumentation, but not situation ethics. It's very situated because it deals with actual persons, actions, motives, and so forth, and competing motives, and all of that drama. And so it's situated, but it's not situation ethics. Do we understand each other on that? Okay? I do not teach Wittenberg Academy students situation ethics. I do teach them I did teach them, sorry, Pastor Kane, I did teach them, I'm still teaching them. They're here, right? So we do teach them how to sort through issues, identify which issues are the most relevant until they get down to the most relevant of the relevant issues, which Cicero calls the quade reagatur, the question at stake. And so we talk about that. We layer that unit on moral argumentation, as I said, on top of a previous unit on forensic argumentation, because that's the roots of rhetorical argument. And we start by understanding how in the Greco-Roman system forensic argumentation was taught. Have you heard of the stasis system? Stases are points of contention. They are where the issues, the movement in the case are checked by competing issues where the claims of the plaintiff check the claims of the defendant, and no progress can be experienced in the case until that issue is resolved. Okay, so the Greco-Roman system, and rhetoric was taught pretty much in a forensic model for 500 years, okay? Right around the time of the Second Sophistic through the golden age of the Roman law courts until, I want to say Quintilian. Boethius started to refine things in the 400s AD. So anyway, we learn all of that, and we read some Boethius, and we read some Quintilian, and we read, so that's where our classical sources, our primary sources come in. And just as a side note, I promised him I'd stay right here. Just as a side note, I don't get into a lot of voluminous readings because this is more of a practical class. We're trying to cultivate mental habits. And so there's a little bit of theory, some nuts and bolts, then an opportunity to practice what they're learning that's tied to the current unit of the class. And then we add another layer of theory, do some more readings, but they're mostly excerpts. I don't tend to use, I tend to reserve lots and lots of reading for high school and college level. All right, and I think Luther had something very good to say about that in the visitation articles. He said, I noticed Mrs. Telke perking up because she wants me to quote it, so I will. He said, I fear that some have their children read too difficult works because they're more concerned about building their reputation than actually educating the children. So I kind of have that bias. All right, yes, we need to read whole volumes. Absolutely. But we don't have to do that in every class. And I do it in very few of my classes. But we read really good material, right? Am I right? It's good stuff. And then we talk about how to apply it to inform our habits of reasoning down to the crux of the matter, to render a good judgment, and then defend that judgment, hence moral argumentation. That's the whole unit. That's what it's based on. And it's the best I have to offer in all of the courses I teach. Because once you roll out the Jehovah's Witness and blood transfusion case, which is a 2-page case brief, it just gets really interesting. It has all the draw of a soap opera because there's all kinds of potentially shady motives, interesting little facts, interpretations of Jehovah's Witness doctrine on transfusion and such. And so we have a 2-page case brief. I present the case brief, we talk about it, and then we have a mock ethics committee meeting that's ungraded. So as you can imagine, nobody invests themselves in that discussion because there's no grade involved. That's another little hobby horse of mine. No, it's interesting. It's inherently interesting and challenging and stimulating. And so everybody jumps on board. And I turn up the pressure cooker by saying, if we don't make this decision in the next 45 minutes, it will be moot. The patient will be permanently and totally disabled. Okay. So how much should I say about the case brief, Sarah? Do you cover that enough in your presentation, you think? Okay. I do think I should sit down. So, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Miss Sarah Bjornstad.
Thank you, Dr. Tallmon. All right. In life, judgments are made every day. Most, however, do not have the potential to change someone's life. In 1991, a woman was admitted to the emergency room and would soon enter critical surgery. A serious controversy regarding her true preferences would pause this surgery, and her fate would be left to her husband and the hospital's ethics committee. Their choice between honoring her newfound religious beliefs regarding blood transfusion and her previously stated wishes regarding her future would eventually decide her lifelong condition. The judgment for this case demands intense and serious thought, requiring a thorough analysis of every aspect of the case and leaving no stone unturned. An overview of the medical indications in the case is first necessary. The patient, a 42-year-old white woman, was hospitalized after 3 hours of an increasingly intense headache. She was presented to the emergency room with a severe occipital headache, mild dizziness, nausea, and vomiting, but was at this stage alert and fully functioning. Tests were run, showing that she had a diffuse brain hemorrhage and an aneurysm in the left carotid artery. After a surgical procedure called a craniotomy, she experienced a mild paralysis followed by complete paralysis of her right side. To avoid complete paralysis for the rest of her life, another procedure would need to take place. However, this procedure required a blood transfusion. As a Jehovah's Witness, she had indicated a refusal of blood, even if it means death. The doctors had halted the craniotomy in respect of her wishes, but, despite the patient's statement, her husband and sister requested a blood transfusion. With the situation stated, the case may begin. The patient's husband and sister brought to the table many realities of the patient's historical preferences about which the Medical Ethics Committee, with whom they were working to make a final decision as to what should be done, could have known nothing. The patient's family made it known that the woman was a new witness of 4 months, and it was stated that the patient's husband sensed that his wife found the community support and the social interaction with the church more important than its teachings about blood. The patient had a 20-year-old disabled son who needed her, and a family to whom she contributed significant financial support. Additionally, she had previously expressed a desire never to be bedridden or unable to communicate. Another important contribution to from the patient's husband and sister was the information that her testimony of the past 20 years contradicted her testimony from the previous 4 months. For 20 years, the patient had stated, and perhaps more importantly, shown her dedication and wish to always care for her disabled son, even declining invitations to vacation away from him. She and her husband had worked different shifts so that someone would always be around to care for him, sacrificing every day in their unrelenting love for him. She worked as a secretary at a school, and her husband worked the night shift in the laundry. She was the primary provider for the family, since her husband had an 8th grade education, earning minimum wage with no benefits. These facts bring forth crucial questions concerning the patient's true preferences. Would she genuinely wish for her son to be without his mother, to whom he related primarily and preferentially? For 20 years, she had loved and continually sacrificed for him. A mother with this much love would undoubtedly wish to be with and care for him for as long as possible, to either the end of his or her days. Additionally, if the transfusion was not given and her procedure was not completed, her husband would have another disabled family member for whom to care. Without the financial support her work provided and the care that she gave, could he handle it? Would she want him to try? Another point the patient's husband and sister brought up was the fact that she had mentioned to both him and her sister, while caring for a cousin in the end stages of cancer, that she wished never to be permanently bedridden or unable to communicate. This is an important statement, as that was exactly what her life would look like were the procedure to be left unfinished. The statement was obviously said with great conviction, and certainly was not something to be taken lightly. However, we must consider all possibilities. Could the patient's husband have had ulterior motives for doubting her preference? It was stated that the husband sensed that his wife found the community support and the social interaction with the church more important than its teachings about blood. He had no proof of the fact. Any judgments he made were purely conjecture, his interpretation of the past events regarding her faith. This would certainly be a convenient way to take advantage of the situation and convince others based on disingenuous intentions. The greater portion of their money was, after all, coming from her employment as a secretary. If she were to be disabled, he would be left to provide for the family and likely need to find another job. With his 8th grade education, he would most likely have to pick up multiple minimum wage jobs rather than one full-time, well-paying position. Upon him would be placed an increased workload and the emotional burden of not one, but 2 disabled immediate family members. The reality of the physical and emotional strain he would endure in this position would frighten anyone. Did he not, then, have any and every reason to twist her words a bit to suit his needs? Although this theory is plausible, I believe it is unlikely and unfounded in light of the couple's history. Yes, of course, the husband's words could be stemming from a place of selfishness and fear, but he presented ample information to support his request that she be given the blood. He had presented her past testimonies of the desires she had held for 20 years, namely her desire to be with her son and take care of him. She also expressly stated that she wished never to become a burden to her family. And to the man's additional credit, he had also already proven himself a man of admirable character, as his past 20 years of service to his family demonstrated. Yes, perhaps he simply did not want two disabled people to care for, but then why not just leave? His unrelenting care for his disabled son, a 20-year-old who only obtained a preschool level of self-care, greatly discourages the notion that he would do something so selfish. The reality of the situation remained that if the doctors did not go through with the procedure, the patient would live the rest of her life in a state of total paralysis, a quality of life so far from what she had always experienced. When the patient entered the hospital fully functioning and filling out forms, she was completely unaware of the specific anticipated risks of the proposed surgery. She had offered the information that she was a Jehovah's Witness to the clerk filling out paperwork, who then asked if she would refuse blood transfusions, after which clarifying that she meant this even in the case of death. How much weight did those words carry, though, especially in the context? Was she asserting this out of loyalty to or fear of the church, not realizing the possibility that this preference could truly be acted upon in a serious manner? She may have been fully functioning, but anyone in a hospital is likely to be at least under a great deal of stress, if not pain, which makes it even more difficult to understand everything thoroughly and to think through every aspect of your statement and its consequences. This could, possibly, and even likely, have led to the patient making a hasty decision. The fact that the family even had to guess and do their best to honor her wishes, while at the same time being unsure of what those wishes truly were, was a testament in and of itself. If the patient had truly felt so strongly about the matter of blood transfusions that she would both die and live for the consequences of this belief, would the family not have known it? It seems that she would have made sure her family knew her wishes, as something so serious as her salvation was on the line. The case analysis states, unfortunately, they had never specifically discussed her wishes concerning transfusion. This renders her initial statement at the hospital doubtful, or at the very least, something to be taken with a grain of salt. Of course, there is merit in the argument that this was a violation of religious freedom. Though opinions of how this belief relates to salvation vary, it is still important. For some Jehovah's Witnesses, a blood transfusion or ingestion directly correlates to their salvation. If one was to accept a transfusion or ingest blood, they would no longer be saved. For others, blood is not an unforgivable sin, merely a sin. Despite this variant in beliefs, it was obviously not acceptable to justify the transfusion based on the fact that she might not have believed it was a sin. However, as was aforementioned, her husband attempted to balance his wife's religious beliefs with the previously expressed wish. His conscience was obviously commanding him to do right by his duty as her husband. The patient was not aware at her arrival to the hospital of what was about to occur within the next few days. The craniotomy was completed, but it did not include the blood transfusion necessary as a safeguard against further loss of mobility. Following this, she developed a mild paralysis followed by a complete paralysis on her right side. Before the procedure, they did not note discussion with the patient regarding specific anticipated risks of the proposed surgery. Without knowing this important information, she could not be making an informed decision to abstain from the blood transfusion. However, by the time they realized she was a Jehovah's Witness, halfway through the procedure, she was unable to communicate. Another level of the case left unclear was exactly what the patient intended by the words, even if it means death. Did she mean that in the specific event of either life or death, she would choose death? Or did she mean that, up to and including the extreme case of death, she would refuse blood transfusion? If the first, the answer is obvious. If the latter, would she now, with the possibility of lifelong paralysis, still hold that death is the worst case scenario? It is one thing to be willing to die for your religious beliefs. It is quite another to live with the result of them. In light of all these facts, the only judgment I can render is in favor of the blood transfusion. If not gone through with, the procedure would leave her in a state in which she had expressly stated she had never wished to be in, an imposition she wished upon no one, and without the ability to care for the son she had spent the past 20 years serving. An entire life's worth of dedication and proof of a desire for continual commitment could be wiped clean because of a few hasty words based on a comparatively shallow testimony of 4 months. In this case, much harm would be done by the failure to complete the procedure. The patient's son, who, related primarily and preferentially to his mother, would never experience that much-needed support freely given by her. Her husband would never again share the burden of his duty as a parent and provider with her, and would have his work doubled at the very least. Even as a willing servant, her husband would experience extreme strain, a feeling for which she had time and again shown a desire to alleviate through her own bearing of burdens, and had pointedly stated the wish never to increase. Adding to this is the critical fact that her faith was just budding. The people closest to her were unsure of how deep her faith ran. In fact, the patient's husband sensed that his wife found the community support and the social interaction with the church more important than its teachings about blood. This decision would completely change life as she knew it, upon which a few critically depended. To make the decision to render her completely paralyzed without any regard for wishes she had expressed before the past 4 months, and that she likely still held up to and during the surgery, would be cruel and dishonest of her husband and sister. No, this could not be done. And with the consideration of those matters, there can be no other outcome than a full blood transfusion. The situation that the hospital's neglect put both the family and the doctors in is awful. Had the charts been checked, the patient fully informed, and the final conclusion regarding her opinion on blood transfusion been rechecked and fully understood, the situation could have been avoided completely. The case analysis leaves ambiguous the exact amount of time between her admittance to the ER and the beginning of her procedure. However, the fact that the doctors did not read or reread her chart before they started the surgical process, in which they knew a blood transfusion would be required, is utterly unacceptable. In the future, the hospital can avoid situations like this, I believe, quite simply. First, they must make it a priority to read the patient's chart thoroughly. Doctors and nurses are busy people, and I have sympathy for them, but it is still imperative that they avoid cases like this at any cost. Secondly, the patient can be asked to elaborate on what they mean by statements such as, even if it means death. A deeper understanding of these things can lead to decisions made with the patient's true preferences in mind and steer the outcome as close to the patient's genuine wishes as possible. The judgment rendered on this case arrives at a dangerous end, no matter the direction it takes. The patient may wake up and sue the hospital for failure to follow the patient's preferences and violating her religious freedoms, or she could wake up in despair and depression for what her life is now doomed to be. However, the lesser of the two evils, and the outcome to which, I believe, concerning the context of the case, the patient would truly want, is that which will allow her to continue caring for her son and the rest of her family. A testimony of 20 years, expressed through both word and action, outweighs a testimony of 4 months on any given day.
One critical thing I forgot to mention is when they get the assignment prompt, they're to write as though they are a medical ethics consultant to the regional medical center where this case was taking place. So you could certainly hear that tone in what Ms. Bjornstad had to say. Could you please field some questions from the audience?
Do my best, yes.
I'm certainly impressed with the husband's reasoning skills in this case, having only an 8th grade education and using the arguments of this is what she's done for the last 20 years, or this is what she's confessed, and were you impressed by that too, or is?
Yeah, I haven't thought of it like that until now, but I would definitely agree with that. That's
I don't think the husband expressed them as eloquently as he was answering questions that were put to him by the medical ethics committee. Right.
Would you argue then that the husband has a legal right for redress, you know, to sue the hospital?
I'm not sure. I would definitely say that she does. In the case that she didn't, that she was still, like, in what?
Well, like, so the case, she's paralyzed right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And had they given the transfusion, she wouldn't be paralyzed.
I see what you mean. Yeah. So, Dr. Tallmon, I'll have to ask you. She was the mild paralysis and the full paralysis on her right side. Those were going to stay no matter what.
Yes, I actually learned this myself after teaching this for a few years from some nursing staff, that just because you give the woman a transfusion doesn't mean she's going to experience, she's not going to regain very much mobility at all. So she'll still be paralyzed most likely, but there is more hope of some recovery with a transfusion than without. So it's pretty bleak.
Yeah. So kind of.
You'd like to think that she'll have rebound all the way, but that's not the case. And we just FYI, in the conversations early on, I just give it to the students, you know, they're going to get sued either way, so it's moot. Don't even waste your breath in your paper on the question of the lawsuit, because it's coming. Either from the church or from the family. Do any of the excuse me, Scott, do any of the Telke gals have a question?
I was just going to say, for your second point when you mentioned that if the hospital decides to let her have the blood transfusion, basically, if there is only fear is of being sued, then it's not in the best interest of the patient, right? It's more only of themselves, whereas if they do not give it to her, then it's less of themselves, right? Would you agree with that?
You might need to rephrase that.
Sorry. No, so if they do not give her the blood transfusion, they're not risking their own, like, right, exactly, their own money of being sued or whatever. But if they give her the blood transfusion, they're for sure risking her suing or the church suing them, right. Which is terrible, because it's probably, as you've just stated, it's in her best interest and probably to her wishes that she would be given the blood transfusion.
Right. So it's more likely that
right. Like if it's just out of fear of a lawsuit,
right,
then it would make more sense just for a patient, because the patient is your sole concern, not yourself. That should be the sole concern.
And that's precisely how care teams look at it. That's why they have lawyers to work those things out, so they don't have to take that into account in their decision-making process. That's part of the profession. They avoid that. Scott did want to ask a question.
So if you are on this team of medical ethicists, my question is, what policy recommendations, other than the ones that you would, I'm trying to put practical legs on this idea, that you are recommending that doctors would very thoroughly look over a patient's chart before they would opt to go for a surgery that could violate the religious sentiments of the patient. So I'm thinking about this as having been a hospital patient back in February, talking to the nurse at the desk in the emergency room, they ask you what your religion is, and to what degree should the ingestion nurses be retrained to ask those leading questions about how to proceed with religiously consequential medical treatment going forward. Instead of, I think there needs to be possibly some higher rhetorical skills involved with either the doctors who are caring for the patient, because as you noted, it could have been too late. But what could be done on the ingestion side? I'm curious if you have thought about those issues, what you would recommend in your, I guess, mock position as a medical ethicist.
And the last part of the assignment is make suggestions to the hospital on how to avoid situations like this in the future.
Can I say take Dr. Tallmon's Rhetoric 2 class? Would that be valid?
Twice.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, just that's the whole problem, is that we don't teach rhetoric anymore, and it's so needed. And you'll learn more about that in Mrs. Benson's and Pastor Kane's sessions, I'm sure. But yeah.
Sarah, I have more of a logistical question about the entire experience as you studied this as a student and as a case study. So after your mock ethics committee had this discussion for 45 minutes, right? And then the assignment was to go and to write your paper. I'm just wondering, what was the, and maybe this is a question for Dr. Tallmon too, did all of the students kind of state their positions by the end of the 45 minutes, or was it, you just kind of all just kept hemming and hawing and taking all the different looks at it from different sides, and then you went home and kind of finalized your position? I'm just wondering about kind of the timeline.
Well, my class was a little interesting. It didn't go as it should have. We had there were a few misunderstandings and slackers. Yeah, unintentional neglect on my part too. But we had one of the live chat sessions to prepare us had been canceled, and so we were supposed to discuss throughout the week and then come to the live chat on Monday and have this 45-minute discussion. Well, that didn't happen. And so Dr. Tallmon had a very short live chat informing us of our neglect, and we went and panic posted on a forum all of our opinions and whatnot. And then Dr. Tallmon told us, you can't make a decision yet. You haven't really thought this through. So he kind of prompted us along, and then we had more of a true discussion on it.
We actually had a really good discussion.
It was, yeah.
After the law.
Mm-hmm.
So, Dr. Tallmon, the design of this, though, is that the students will discuss, debate,
withhold judgment,
and then and kind of look at it from multiple perspectives.
Yeah.
And then the paper is where their final rendering comes.
Yes, and they have to go through that whole process. And you have a lot more thought about it after you have the non-graded exercise, right?
For sure.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Did you ever, before deciding that she needed to live or be given the blood transfusion, did you ever think, well, maybe I should go the opposite way and say, no, she should not take the blood transfusion? What made, obviously you've written all of this. Is there any particular point that you were well, this is what is
Yeah.
the point?
My first inclination was to go, this is her religious freedom. You can't infringe upon that. That's awful.
She said it point blank.
Yeah. And I would not want that done to me. But the The tipping point was 20 years versus 4 months. And that's just, you can't beat that.
Emily, and then you get the last question because you've been so patient. Thank you.
Dr. Tallmon, did anybody else have the opposite opinion? Have you ever had anybody?
Oh yeah, there are people that make the case that she was a new Jehovah's Witness, a new conversion trumps any previous experience, and she said, it's in quotation marks in the quote in the case brief, so it's in quotes, even if it means death, you are obligated to follow her wishes. Thank you very much. End of discussion. I've had several people over the years do that, but barely any at Wittenberg Academy.
Was there anybody in our class? Was there anybody in our class this year?
No. No, there was consensus that she should be transfused. Yes. And I want to point out, in terms of the thought processes that you do acquire when you go through this kind of exercise, the time element is something that's easily overlooked until you start to weigh it like this. 4 months, 20 years. How much does the conversion trump the past history? You know, it's a fine, very precise reasoning process based on practical wisdom. And I love it. I love the opportunity to hone those intellectual skills. Yes, sir. I forgot your name.
I'm Dylan Thompson.
Dylan Thompson.
Haven't been at one of these since I was in high school, so
Welcome back.
thanks. I was looking more at the structural side of the discussion. Sort of shows that you don't assign conclusions. I was wondering, like, other times you've done this, have you tried assigning, like, you need to make the best argument for this conclusion? Your job is to argue and conclude that you shouldn't do the transfusion.
Well, I have plenty of assignments where they're supposed to persuade about policy questions and that sort of thing, and they have to take a side and they have to suggest why this side makes more sense than that side. But in this case, that would be taboo for me, because the whole point is to weigh the question at stake and to arrive at the crux of the matter as you see it, and then make the best case possible. And I do encourage them, as a matter of fact, to argue for the side they disagree with, just for the sake of an academic exercise, and to learn how to, and not to confuse personal beliefs with the ability to, you know, engage in an academic exercise to the best of your ability. And I do that in debate as well. You know, debate, you go in one round and argue for this side, and then the next round you argue the opposite side. Oh, those people must have no scruples. No, it's a game.
Yeah, so, like, I have discussions and teach at Concordia, so I have discussions with students, and I frequently have trouble with a group thing happen.
Yeah.
So do you have to interfere?
It's a good antidote to groupthink. Yeah, I have had to intervene in the past when people start to get on a narrative and the most vocal and popular kids
Right.
start to dominate. It doesn't happen online at all. Well, except it may happen in the chat box.
The fastest typist.
But in face-to-face, yeah, that's right, the fastest type. In face-to-face classes at the college level, quite often, a meme starts to take over. And by meme, I don't mean social media meme, I mean the actual thing. It takes on a life of its own, and it starts to dominate, and it dominates perspectives, and then people get into groupthink. And I will check that if I perceive that that's going on. Just as it's a learning opportunity as well. Well, we're over time, so let's hear it one more time for